Whispers in the wind. The wind rustled through the tall grass surrounding the ranch, carrying the faint scent of hay and earth. Lian's small hands traced the rough edges of the wooden fence as she leaned forward, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped behind distant hills. She whispered, almost to herself, "I'm not pretty." Her words seemed to vanish into the evening air, fragile as the blades of grass swaying beneath her fingers. Gideon, towering and broad-shouldered, stepped closer. His heavy boots pressed into the dirt softly, yet each step carried weight. He crouched, careful not to startle her, and offered a hand to steady her. "That's fine," he said, his voice low and steady. "I love humbleness." The words were simple, but in them, Lian sensed sincerity stronger than any grand declaration. She looked down, her fingers brushing against his as she pulled back reflexively. The ranch stretched endlessly, a patchwork of fields, barns, and corral fences. Gideon moved along a line of livestock, checking the posts and gates. Lian followed, a small shadow among the giants of the ranch, her steps careful to match his rhythm. She observed him, how his fingers grazed the wood, how his gaze lingered on the smallest details others might overlook. In those moments, she felt a strange mix of admiration and intimidation, an awareness of her own perceived shortcomings. Even in silence, their presence together spoke volumes. The clink of metal tools, the soft thud of hooves, and the occasional call of distant birds filled the air. Gideon glanced at her, noticing the way her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, the slight tremor of her hands. His lips curved subtly, almost imperceptibly, as he caught her eye, then looked away, letting the moment linger. From the edge of the field, Elena's silhouette appeared. She leaned against the barn, arms crossed, a smile barely concealing her curiosity. Lian's heart thudded faster, though she didn't yet understand why. Elena's presence was quiet but potent, like a shadow stretching across a sunlit path. Gideon's attention did not waver. He continued his work, but Lian felt a prickle of uncertainty, a whisper of tension she could neither name nor confront. By noon, the sun hung high, scattering golden light across the pasture. Lian and Gideon paused near the water trough, hands damp from washing the feeding buckets. Lian's fingers brushed his as she reached for the last bucket. She froze, her mind racing with questions of self-worth. Gideon noticed and gave a soft nod, as if to reassure her that the world would not crumble for her hesitation. The day passed in a rhythm of labor and quiet companionship. When they rested, Gideon leaned back against the fence, arms crossed over his chest. Lian sat nearby, legs tucked beneath her, tracing patterns in the dirt. Their conversation was sparse, punctuated by shared laughter over minor mishaps, spilled grain, a startled calf, but the silence between them was equally telling. It held a comfort that Lian had never known, a recognition without expectation. Yet the peace was fragile. Elena watched from a distance, eyes flicking between the two, subtle movements betraying a curiosity that bordered on desire. Lian noticed the glances and felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. She wanted to ask Gideon, to seek reassurance, but the words lodged stubbornly in her throat. Instead, she focused on the sway of the grass and the distant hum of the ranch, trying to anchor herself in something tangible. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the ground, Gideon spoke again, this time with a softer edge. "Lian," he said, turning his body slightly toward her, though keeping his face away. "You have a quiet strength. Don't let doubts define you." The words, faceless and unadorned, carried a warmth that brushed against her insecurities. Lian's shoulders relaxed, and she allowed herself a small, grateful smile. The day ended with them walking along the edge of the pasture, silhouettes moving together but separate, shadows stretching behind them like echoes of what might be. The tension lingered, unspoken, unresolved, but within it was a promise of connection, fragile and intricate. And somewhere in the distance, Elena's quiet observation served as a reminder that the world beyond their fragile peace held complications yet to unfold. With the first hints of twilight painting the sky, Lian felt both comforted and unsettled. She knew tomorrow would bring more labor, more shared moments, and, perhaps, more questions. The ranch breathed around them, alive and indifferent, yet somehow accommodating the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. The whisper of the wind carried her insecurities, but also a faint trace of hope, a fragile thread tying her to the giant beside her. Threads of desire. The morning mist clung to the fields, curling around fence posts and the hooves of the grazing cattle. Lian moved quietly, her fingers brushing the wet grass as she followed Gideon to the barn. He worked with a steady rhythm, lifting hay bales with effortless strength, his silhouette outlined by the rising sun. Each movement was deliberate, a dance of precision and power that seemed to mesmerize her. "Careful with that one," Gideon said, his voice low, almost a murmur over the morning clamor. Lian hesitated, her hands trembling as she adjusted the bale. When their fingers brushed, the contact lingered for a fraction longer than necessary. Lian felt her chest tighten, a warmth blooming in the hollow of her ribs. Gideon's glance met hers briefly, faceless yet charged with quiet recognition. They worked side by side, their silence punctuated only by the rhythmic scraping of tools and the occasional grunt from Gideon as he shifted heavy loads. The routine was comforting, grounding, but beneath it lay a fragile thread of tension. Lian noticed the way Gideon's gaze occasionally softened when he looked at her, how he lingered near her side longer than he needed. She wanted to believe it was kindness, but the flutter in her stomach whispered of something deeper, something forbidden in its intensity. From the barn doorway, Elena appeared again, leaning casually against the frame. Her presence was like a shadow stretching across a sunlit path, subtle but impossible to ignore. She smiled faintly, tilting her head as she watched Gideon and Lian move among the livestock. There was something deliberate in her posture, an ease that suggested familiarity, perhaps even entitlement. Lian felt a tight, knot coil in her stomach, but she forced herself to return to work, lowering her gaze and pretending the tension did not exist. Gideon spoke to Elena, his words polite, casual. Lian could not hear their exchange, only the sound of Gideon's laugh. A brief, warm note that cut through the morning air. Lian's fingers froze on the hay bale. A pang of jealousy, sudden and unbidden, surged through her. She told herself it was irrational, that Gideon's attention belonged to her in every meaningful way, yet doubt lingered like a shadow at the edges of her awareness. As the day progressed, the ranch became a theater of subtle signals. Gideon would hand her a tool, linger near her side, or offer a quiet word of encouragement. Lian treasured these moments, replaying them in her mind with a careful intimacy. But each small gesture was mirrored by Elena's understated presence, her laughter drifting across the yard, her eyes flicking toward Gideon at unexpected intervals. The duality of attention left Lian unmoored, caught between joy and unease. During lunch, they gathered near the well, the sunlight streaming in golden rays that caught in the dust and hay particles. Lian poured water into tin cups, her hands trembling slightly as she handed one to Gideon. He accepted it with a nod, their fingers brushing, lingering. She dared a glance at him, but he looked away, focusing on the water as if to steady himself. Elena approached, holding a small basket of freshly baked bread. "Morning, both of you," she said, her voice light but layered with something unsaid. She set the bread near them, lingering close enough that Lian could feel the warmth radiating from her presence. Gideon acknowledged her with a polite smile, his body facing her briefly before turning back to Lian. Lian's heart pounded, a mixture of fear, jealousy, and desire coursing through her. The afternoon moved slowly, the heat pressing down as they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by the wind. Lian's hands brushed Gideon's more than once, and each time, the world seemed to narrow to that fleeting connection. She noticed the way Elena's shadow fell across the worksite, her movements deliberate, calculated to draw attention. Lian's mind raced, the earlier tranquility of the ranch giving way to confusion and longing. By evening, the sun dipped low, painting the fields in muted gold and amber. Lian leaned against the fence, watching Gideon check the last of the livestock. Their eyes met briefly, faceless and unspoken, a silent acknowledgement of the day's shifting currents. Elena's silhouette faded behind the barn, leaving an unspoken tension in the air, a reminder that the tranquility of the ranch was never absolute. Lian exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over her. She knew the day had changed something subtly but irrevocably. The thread of connection between her and Gideon had strengthened, yet a new tension had been woven into their lives, a silent challenge that neither of them could fully name. Tomorrow would bring more work, more closeness, and perhaps more complications. But for now, the shadows lengthened, and the wind whispered through the grass, carrying secrets and desires that would not remain hidden for long. Shadows between hearts. The dawn broke in muted shades of gray, casting long, trembling shadows across the ranch. Lian stepped out onto the dew-soaked earth, her boots leaving delicate impressions that the morning mist began to swallow. She carried a basket of feed, her fingers tightening around the woven handle, knuckles pale from the weight of unsaid words and quiet suspicions. Gideon was already at the corral, adjusting the gates, the early light catching the edges of his worn hat and the curve of his strong shoulders. Lian approached, careful not to make a sound, and set the basket down beside him. Their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, yet enough to stir an unexpected ache in her chest. Gideon's faceless profile inclined slightly, acknowledging her presence, but his attention remained on the fence line. The day began like many others, with repetitive labor and shared silence, but an undercurrent had shifted. Elena appeared unexpectedly, carrying a small bundle of cloth and what smelled faintly of fresh bread. She lingered near the barn, her movements casual yet deliberate, and greeted Gideon with a laugh that carried too easily across the field. Lian's stomach twisted, her pulse quickened, and for the first time, she felt truly exposed, not in body but in heart. As Gideon helped Elena with a stubborn gate latch, Lian worked quietly nearby, glancing up more often than she cared to admit. Their laughter, low and unassuming, tugged at her insecurities. She reminded herself that he had reassured her of her worth, that his hands had once brushed hers with affection and gentleness. Yet the warmth of those moments now felt fragile, threatened by Elena's encroaching presence. Later, near the water trough, Gideon handed Lian a wet cloth to wipe down the buckets. Their hands met again, this time lingering longer than necessary, but his mind seemed divided. Lian felt the brush of Elena's energy in the back of her consciousness, a phantom she could neither name nor banish. The sunlight glinted off the water, reflecting the unspoken tension that stretched across the yard like an invisible cord, taut and trembling. Lian retreated to the barn loft under the pretense of gathering tools, though her thoughts churned faster than her movements. From above, she could see Gideon speaking with Elena, the gestures subtle, an accidental touch of the shoulder, a shared glance, but enough to ignite a spark of fear within her. She closed her eyes briefly, taking a shaky breath. The ache in her chest was not for physical loss. It was the betrayal of expectations, of assumed intimacy, now challenged. When she descended, Gideon was alone, tending to the livestock. His movements were slower now, deliberate, as if the morning's distraction had weighed upon him. Lian handed him a freshly filled water bucket, and their fingers met in a fleeting touch, a reminder of what had been hers, yet tinged with uncertainty. He looked toward her, faceless but attentive, and offered a small nod, a gesture of reassurance, though it carried a subtle, unspoken conflict. By afternoon, the ranch seemed alive with quiet turbulence. Elena lingered near the edge of the field, occasionally glancing at Lian, her expression unreadable but charged with intent. Lian worked steadily, her hands steady but her mind racing, imagining conversations that had never occurred, imagining intimacies that might exist. The air itself seemed to press against her chest, each gust of wind a whisper of doubt. Evening arrived with muted light, painting the landscape in long strokes of amber and gold. Lian stood by the fence, watching Gideon as he adjusted the last corral post. She wanted to speak, to voice her suspicions, to demand clarity, but the words clung to her throat. Gideon glanced at her briefly, faceless, and in that motion lay both reassurance and confusion, a duality she could neither resolve nor ignore. The day ended with shadows stretching long across the pasture. Lian retreated to the loft, her heart pounding with questions she dared not ask aloud. The quiet of the ranch no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, laden with secrets, desires, and the first ache of jealousy that had taken root. She knew, with an unsettling clarity, that the simplicity she had once treasured, the warmth of Gideon's quiet admiration, the rhythm of shared labor, was now complicated. The presence of another, Elena, had inserted a silent wedge between them, and Lian could feel the distance growing, subtle but undeniable. She pressed her hands to the loft's rough wood railing and exhaled slowly, letting the tension ebb only slightly. Tomorrow would bring more work, more subtle gestures, and perhaps more truths unveiled in ways that words could not capture. For the first time, Lian realized that love, even gentle, faceless, humble love, was vulnerable, and desire, once stirred, could challenge even the most serene of hearts. The wind whispered through the barn rafters, carrying both warning and invitation, a promise that nothing on the ranch would remain as simple as it had been. The weight of truth. The sun hung low, a muted orb casting long, trembling shadows across the ranch. Lian stood at the edge of the pasture, her fingers gripping the rough wood of the fence, knuckles pale and trembling. The quiet hum of the farm was heavy, each sound magnified in the charged silence. The clink of a distant bucket, the low nicker of a horse, the faint rustle of grass in the evening breeze. Gideon approached, his boots crunching softly on the dirt path, hands roughened by labor, yet careful as he reached out toward her. For a long moment, they stood apart, faceless, their distance filled with unsaid words and restrained emotion. Lian swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making speech nearly impossible. She wanted to ask, to demand clarity, but the words tangled, fragile as the shadows around them. Finally, Gideon broke the quiet. "Lian," he said, voice low measured. He did not attempt to meet her eyes, focusing instead on the fence post between them. "I never intended for things to be complicated." His hands moved briefly, adjusting a loose plank, a nervous gesture that mirrored the unease in his chest. Lian's fingers tightened around the fence, her breath hitching. Elena's presence earlier that day had left invisible marks, small yet undeniable. Gideon's polite attentions, the shared laughter, the moments of fleeting closeness, all had shifted Lian's perception of their bond. Now, confronted with the quiet tension of the evening, she understood the vulnerability that had allowed doubt to creep in. "I saw," she whispered, voice barely audible, "how close you were with her." Gideon's shoulders stiffened subtly, his hands stilling on the fence. Faceless, he gestured toward the pasture, toward the setting sun. "It was nothing beyond friendship," he said. I didn't realize how it might look, how it might make you feel." There was no excuse in his tone, only acknowledgement, and it struck Lian with both relief and lingering uncertainty. Her heart was a tangle of emotions: relief, betrayal, love, and fear. She wanted to step forward, to collapse against him, but the weight of yesterday's doubts anchored her in place. Her fingers brushed the fence again, tracing grooves as if searching for answers in the wood grain. "I trusted. I thought I understood." Her voice faltered. "I wanted to be simple." But the words hung, unfinished, suspended in the amber light. Gideon stepped closer, careful, deliberate, bridging the small gap between them. His hand hovered over hers, brushing her fingers lightly. The gesture was intimate, faceless, and filled with a tenderness that spoke louder than words. Simplicity isn't the same as ease, he murmured. Love, connection, they're never simple. But they're worth facing every shadow, every doubt. The wind carried their silence, wrapping around them like a shared secret. Lian felt the tension in her chest begin to ease, replaced by a fragile understanding. Emotional infidelity, real or perceived, could fracture trust, but honesty and openness could mend it, slowly, carefully. She exhaled, long and measured, allowing the weight of suspicion to drift into the fading light. Elena's silhouette had disappeared beyond the barn, a quiet absence that underscored the evening's resolution. Lian and Gideon remained, faceless yet intimately connected, hands brushing, bodies angled in proximity yet not pressed together, bound by unspoken understanding. In the stillness, they found the space to forgive, to reassess the fragile threads of their bond, to recognize that love demanded courage as much as devotion. The sun sank fully below the horizon, casting the ranch into dusky purples and muted blues. Lian's hand slipped fully into Gideon's, fingers intertwining with a tentative yet deliberate trust. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic confrontations, only the quiet recognition that they had faced doubt and emerged with the possibility of renewal. As the shadows lengthened, the ranch breathed around them, indifferent yet accommodating. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it both caution and hope. Lian leaned slightly closer, feeling the rough warmth of Gideon's hand, and allowed herself a small smile. He responded with the faintest inclination of his head, faceless but present, a silent acknowledgement that the past day's turbulence had altered them, but had not undone them. The night descended, cool and still, and the ranch seemed to exhale, releasing the tension that had held them in suspended uncertainty. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new labor, and new moments of quiet intimacy. But for tonight, the world was reduced to the warmth of a hand, the subtle brush of presence, and the fragile, enduring promise that simplicity in love did not require perfection, only honesty, resilience, and the courage to remain.